Everyone keeps repeating this one thing about the Mamas and the Papas, that they were just another beautiful 1960s harmony group who faded away naturally when the decade ended. But that belief is completely wrong. What actually happened to them was not a gentle decline, not a slow loss of relevance, and not a case of audiences moving on. It was a sudden internal collapse that began while they were still at the very top, selling millions of records, defining the sound of an era, and shaping what American pop music would become. Their fall was not caused by changing trends or a lack of talent. It was driven by human chaos, emotional entanglement, and pressure that arrived faster than the band was ever prepared to handle. To understand why their story is so different, you have to understand how fast they rose. In late 1965, American music was changing rapidly. Folk was colliding with pop, rock was becoming more expressive, and the idea of the California sound was beginning to dominate radio. Out of this moment came four voices that sounded unlike anything else. When California Dreamin' hit the airwaves, it didn't just succeed as a song, it felt like a mood, a feeling, a place. Within months, the Mamas and the Papas went from near anonymity to being unavoidable. Their harmonies were tight but emotional, polished but intimate, and instantly recognizable. By 1966, they were not just successful, they were essential. But here is the part most people miss. While the public saw sunshine, harmony, and effortless cool, the band itself was already cracking beneath the surface. Unlike many groups of the era, this was not a band held together by simple friendship or shared struggle. It was a band formed through complicated personal relationships that never had clear boundaries. John Phillips was the primary songwriter and de facto leader. Michelle Phillips was his wife. Denny Doherty was emotionally involved with Michelle. Cass Elliot was watching all of this unfold while trying to hold the musical center together. From the outside, it looked like chemistry. On the inside, it was emotional volatility waiting to explode. Their success accelerated everything. In 1966 and 1967, the band released hit after hit. Monday reached number 1. Albums sold in massive numbers. Awards followed. Television appearances multiplied. They were performing at the most important events of the era, including the Monterey Pop Festival, standing alongside artists who would later become legends. But the pressure of success did not bring unity. It magnified every unresolved issue. Recording sessions became tense, trust eroded, personal resentment began to leak into professional decisions. By 1967, while the band was still charting, the internal damage had reached a breaking point. Michelle Phillips was briefly removed from the group because of personal conflicts tied directly to relationships within the band. This decision alone revealed how unstable the situation had become. Removing 1/4 of a harmony-based group at the height of its fame was not a calculated business move. It was an emotional reaction to a situation that had spun out of control. Although Michelle returned shortly afterward, the damage was permanent. The sense of safety that allows creative collaboration was gone. At the same time, substance abuse was becoming more severe. Drug use in the 1960s music scene was not unusual, but in this case, it compounded already fragile relationships. Focus suffered. Performances became inconsistent. The gap between their flawless studio recordings and their real-life interactions grew wider. What audiences heard on vinyl no longer reflected what the band experienced in reality. What makes this story especially tragic is that the public had no idea how close the collapse already was. From the outside, the Mamas and the Papas still looked like one of the strongest groups in American music. They were still being played constantly on the radio. Their image was still tied to optimism, freedom, and harmony. But internally, the group was functioning more like four individuals moving in different emotional directions, bound together only by contracts and expectations. By 1968, the momentum began to slip, not because the audience stopped listening, but because the band could no longer operate as a unified creative force. New material lacked the spark of earlier work. Recording became more fragmented. Decisions were no longer collective. The sense of shared purpose that defined their early success had vanished. Within a few years of their peak, the group was effectively finished. And this is the cliffhanger most people never consider. The Mamas and the Papas did not fall because they failed to adapt to the times. They fell because they reached the top too quickly, with personal dynamics that could not survive success. Their collapse happened while the world still wanted them, while the radio was still open to them, and while the culture still saw them as symbols of an era. Everyone keeps repeating this one thing about the collapse of bands like this, that success itself is what breaks them. But that idea is incomplete. In the case of the Mamas and the Papas, success did not simply expose cracks, it forced unresolved personal relationships into a public, professional space where there was no room to escape them. What happened next was not sudden, but it was inevitable once the band crossed a point of no return. After their explosive rise, the internal structure of the group became dangerously unbalanced. John Phillips was unquestionably the creative engine. He wrote most of the material, shaped the sound, and acted as the decision-maker. But leadership inside a band only works when trust exists, and by 1967, that trust was gone. Personal betrayals had blurred every line between marriage, friendship, and work. Arguments were no longer about music. They were about loyalty, resentment, and emotional damage that never had time to heal. Cass Elliot, often seen by the public as the joyful, powerful voice of the group, was quietly dealing with her own frustration. Despite her vocal importance and public popularity, she was consistently marginalized in decision-making. She contributed enormously to the sound, but control remained elsewhere. Over time, this created a deep sense of imbalance. She was carrying the emotional and musical weight of performances while having little influence over the direction of the band. That frustration did not erupt publicly, but it drained the cohesion that a harmony group absolutely depends on. Denny Doherty, meanwhile, struggled with insecurity and emotional dependency that worsened as the band fractured. His relationship with Michelle Phillips left scars that never healed, and those unresolved emotions carried directly into the studio and onto the stage. Instead of four voices moving together, the group increasingly felt like four separate tensions colliding in the same space. By 1968, the music industry itself was changing. Rock was becoming heavier, more political, and more experimental. Bands that survived this shift were often those with strong internal unity or a clear leader who could adapt the sound. The Mamas and the Papas had neither. They were tied to a sound built on emotional harmony at a moment when emotional honesty inside the group had completely collapsed. That contradiction made evolution nearly impossible. Recording sessions during this period became fragmented. Members recorded parts separately. Communication broke down. What once felt organic now felt mechanical. The album still contained moments of brilliance, but the spirit that defined their early work was missing. Critics noticed. Sales slowed. The sense of inevitability that once surrounded their success quietly evaporated. What is crucial to understand here is that this was not a failure of talent. If anything, the talent remained intact. The problem was that the band no longer functioned as a band. They were four individuals trapped inside a brand that demanded unity they could no longer provide. Every performance became an act of endurance rather than expression. Every release felt like an obligation instead of a statement. By 1969, the situation was no longer sustainable. The band officially disbanded just a few years after defining an entire musical moment. There was no dramatic farewell tour, no grand final album, just an acknowledgement that the structure had collapsed beyond repair. For a group that once symbolized togetherness and harmony, the ending was quiet, fractured, and unresolved. What followed makes their story even more unsettling. Individually, they all continued on separate paths, each carrying a piece of what the band once was. Cass Elliot found solo success and public affection, yet her life was tragically short. John Phillips continued writing and producing, but remained haunted by addiction and controversy. The others moved in and out of the spotlight, always connected to a past that overshadowed their present. And here is where the story becomes more than just a band history. The Mamas and the Papas became a warning. They proved that massive success can arrive before emotional foundations are ready to support it. They showed how personal relationships, when left unresolved, can turn artistic chemistry into creative poison. Their collapse was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, internal, and irreversible. By the early 1970s, something unusual had already happened to the Mamas and the Papas. They were gone, but they were everywhere. Their songs never disappeared from radio rotation. California Dreamin' kept returning every time America looked back at the 1960s. Monday remained shorthand for a certain emotional softness that newer rock bands no longer tried to express. In a strange way, their absence froze them in time. Because they collapsed so early, they never had the chance to dilute their legacy with a long, uneven decline. What remained was a short, intense burst of perfection, sealed off from everything that followed. This is where the story becomes more complicated. When a band collapses at its peak, history tends to romanticize them. The public remembers the sound, not the pain, the harmonies, not the arguments, the sunshine, not the shadows behind it. Over time, the Mamas and the Papas became less a band and more a symbol of an era that people wanted to remember as simpler than it actually was. Their music was used in films, documentaries, commercials, and retrospectives about the 1960s, often stripped of the context that created it. But inside the industry, musicians understood the truth. Other artists knew how fragile that harmony had been. They knew how rare it was for four voices to lock together the way these four did, and how easy it was for that magic to vanish once trust disappeared. Their influence did not come from longevity, it came from impact. They showed that vocal harmony could be emotional rather than ornamental, that pop music could feel intimate without being small, and that songwriting could sound effortless while carrying deep emotional weight. Attempts to reunite the group over the years never truly worked. The chemistry that mattered was gone, and time only widened the distance. Reunions reminded audiences of what once existed, but they also made clear that the band belonged to a specific moment that could not be recreated. The world had moved on, and so had they. What once felt urgent now felt historical. Cass Elliott's death in 1974 permanently closed the door on any genuine reunion. With her passing, the emotional center of the band disappeared. She had been the voice that grounded the harmonies, the presence that gave their sound weight and warmth. Without her, the Mamas and the Papas could no longer exist as anything more than a memory. From that point forward, the band's story stopped evolving and became fixed. What makes their rise and fall so instructive is that it wasn't driven by external forces. There was no industry conspiracy, no sudden shift in audience taste that pushed them aside. Their collapse came from within, accelerated by success rather than failure. Fame did not save them. It magnified everything they had avoided dealing with when they were still unknown. This is why their story continues to resonate. Many bands struggle for years, and then slowly fade. The Mamas and the Papas exploded, defined a sound, and vanished almost immediately afterward. They remind us that harmony in music does not guarantee harmony in life, and that creative chemistry can be both a gift and a liability. The story of the Mamas and the Papas ultimately matters because it exposes a truth that rarely gets talked about when we celebrate legendary music. We love to frame great bands as unified forces, as families brought together by destiny and talent, but the reality is often far more fragile. In this case, the same emotional intensity that created their sound also made it impossible for them to survive success. Their harmonies worked because they were emotionally charged, but that charge came at a cost they did not know how to manage once fame arrived. What separates their fall from so many others is how little time they had to adjust. Most bands spend years struggling before success, learning how to resolve conflict, how to separate personal life from professional survival. The Mamas and the Papas skipped that phase entirely. They went from formation to superstardom in a matter of months. There was no buffer, no learning curve, no emotional infrastructure to support the pressure that followed. When conflict appeared, there was nowhere for it to go except inward, where it slowly dismantled everything they had built. This is why their collapse feels so sudden in hindsight. It wasn't that the music stopped working. It was that the people making it could no longer coexist. Once trust disappeared, harmony became impossible, no matter how talented they were. Their story proves that artistic chemistry is not enough. Longevity requires boundaries, communication, and emotional discipline, especially when success accelerates faster than personal growth. And yet, their legacy remains intact precisely because they did not linger long enough to become a shadow of themselves. They didn't release decades of diminishing returns. They didn't chase trends to stay relevant. They left behind a concentrated body of work that still feels timeless. In a strange way, their early collapse preserved their greatness. What we remember is the sound at its peak, not the slow erosion that so often follows. This is also why their story fits perfectly into a larger pattern. Music history is filled with bands that reached the top before they were ready to survive it. Some were destroyed by business, some by addiction, some by ego, and some, like this band, by emotional entanglements that fame only intensified. When you start looking at music this way, you realize how many legendary sounds were born from unstable foundations. If this story surprised you, it's because the popular version of music history often leaves out the uncomfortable parts. It celebrates the hits but ignores the human cost behind them. That's exactly what this channel is about. Not just the rise, but the moment where everything starts to unravel. Not just success, but what happens after the peak, when reality catches up. So if you want to understand why some of the greatest bands burned out in just a few years, why brilliance doesn't always equal longevity, and how fame can quietly dismantle what it touches, make sure you stay here. Every video dives into another story like this one, another band that reached the top and then disappeared far faster than anyone expected. If you found this video valuable, take a second to like the video, because it helps this channel reach more people who care about real music history, not just headlines. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the rise and fall of legendary bands, and let me know in the comments which group you want covered next. There are many more stories like this waiting to be told, and chances are, your favorite band's past is more fragile than you ever realized.